we deliberately stay away from the word resilience. We don't say we run resilience programs because I think resilience has become a bit of a crutch in the organisation. Mm-hmm. Resilience ultimately means that you have the ability to cope in the face of adversity, and we're aiming for something far more ambitious than that. I think if you're just tolerating adversity and can keep pushing and pushing and pushing, you're going to burn out.
Welcome to the In Our Minds podcast. My name is Bianca Cuthill and I am your host and CEO of Innerwell. Today we're joined by Tahnee Clark, CEO of Alfi Health. In this episode, we're going to cover crisis management, trauma response, and technology and the role that it can play in actually helping busy clinicians. So let's get started. Tahnee, thank you so much for joining us today on the In Our Minds podcast. Really looking forward to unpacking some areas of your background.
Thank you.
So Tahnee Clark, tell us a little bit about who you are and what brought you to the couch here today.
So I have been a psychologist for the best part of the last 20 years. I have a huge amount of passion in this area and hope I continue to work in this area until almost the day I die, I guess. Fortunately, I've been privileged enough to be able to be on the advisory board for Innerwell. So I'm the CEO of a specialist advisory organisation called Alfi Health, and we kind of work at the intersection of mental health, organisational structure and clinical governance and best practice. Amazing. 3 areas that we kind of focus on is around psychosocial risk and hazard, looking at capability and growth within an organisation and specialist programs, and also clinical governance. Yeah.
You've had a really interesting career, as you said, that spanned, 2 decades in mental health. And, particularly, I think the area that I really want to start and what sets you apart from most people in mental health is that, you're one of the first responding psychologists in the Lindt Cafe siege that took place a number of years ago. Can you take us back to that moment when you got that call? What was going through your head at the time?
Yeah. There was a lot going on actually at that time. I had been working on another on-site critical incident that was really intense for the best part of a month, for long hours every day. And it was actually someone within that organisation that actually came up to me, and there was just TVs around in this workplace that I was at. They said, something really big is going on in the city. I don't know if you'll be going home tonight. And so then I went to the TV and had a look. Then I got a call from my boss, had a chat to them, and they're like, you're on standby, this might be a long night. Then was just continuously getting a bit of intelligence about where things were at to make sure that I was fully briefed. And then as soon as you get the call, I guess you're just, all right, we're on. And I guess the main thing you're then focusing on is what do really people need in that environment. So you're not really considering your own emotional needs. You're really kind of falling back on your own training and skill set to then just really focus on who's impacted here, what is going to be the best support for them right now, and how can I make sure that this environment is as calm and safe as possible for people.
Yeah, because it's pretty heavy for whether first responders. I mean, we all remember where we were on that day when that obviously took place. And how did that and responding to other frontline experiences, even like the Nepal earthquakes, how does that shape how you think about what's important in delivering effective mental health care?
Yeah, I think they had a really pivotal impact on myself personally and my career. And it's actually had a major influence on the decisions on how I even structure my own organisation now and how we support organisations. I think a lot of the times you might find that even really well-intended managers might call a psychologist to be on site at 2 a.m. in the morning. But what we kind of realised through the research is you don't necessarily always need a psychologist on site in those hours. Really what people need is connection with people. They need safety. They need calmness. And so if they're absolutely exhausted, where they really should be going is going back to a safe environment where they can rest, where they can have nutrition, water, really meeting their absolute bare basic needs. And it's then them understanding that support will be available for them when they need it. And being able to follow up with them over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I know you and I have spoken about this previously in terms of your experience with, first responders and the programs that you've sort of built out based on all those sort of lived experiences from your sort of perspective. Now that you've moved from being, that person on the ground in those crisis moments to leading, obviously a mental health company, and particularly for yourself in Alfi Health, for listeners who aren't familiar with Alfi Health, can you tell us a bit more about what it is that you do and how that's taken shape?
Yeah, so with those kind of 3 pillar areas, I guess the first one is around that psychosocial risk and hazards. We'll go into organisation. This is, I guess, particularly important now with a lot of the regulatory. All states and territories now have work health and safety requirements, and it's really quite broad, and it's very, very serious. Like some of those things there in terms of senior leaders and directors now have a real duty of care, and those duty of care, if it's not taken seriously, and a lot of that seriousness is not just reactive anymore, it's around showing that you're taking initiative, you're doing preventative work, you're creating efficient frameworks to make people feel safe and ensure they are safe. And if those things aren't in place, there's multi-million-dollar fines, there's manslaughter charges. It's a big deal. Yeah. We're really starting to grow up as a country and become far more sophisticated around, we don't wait until, something bad happens. Yeah. Let's kind of go back to the drawing board and just run really well-governed organisations from the start. And I don't mean bottlenecks, because I know that for a lot of people that's compliance feels like this huge level of red tape. It's around making everything far more efficient, and it actually on your bottom dollar is far more effective as well. So working with the individuals in a really realistic way. And I think what helps is because of a lot of the experience that we've had on the front line and seeing that you can't just throw a big book at someone. Like when things are moving and you're running these big high pace, high demand organizations, you need to kind of be at their pace, and you need to be able to make sure that you can make their systems practical, easy to understand and efficient. And so we work with organizations on that. The other one is around that we build out capability and growth within organizations, and that's really supporting leaders, leveraging leaders to really understand the capability with an organisation. We deliberately stay away from the word resilience. We don't say we run resilience programs, because I think resilience has become a bit of a crutch in the organisation. Resilience ultimately means that you have the ability to cope in the face of adversity, and we're aiming for something far more ambitious than that. I think if you're just tolerating adversity and can keep pushing and pushing and pushing, you're going to burn out. And I guess one of the other things that we notice is that even when people are really brave and strong, and for most part people do push through trauma and critical incidents, just like a bone that breaks and then it recovers, it's no longer broken, but there's scar tissue. And so when people are exposed to unhealthy or toxic environments, there is impact, and it bleeds out in different ways, whether it's sleep impact, or they're just a little bit short, or they make more simple mistakes. And so we help organisations really leverage and grow and use this intelligence through data to really kind of put some muscle into being a high performance effective organisation. And then the last one there is mainly around the clinical governance perspective, which I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to support Interwell on, because I know Interwell really appreciates this part, particularly in technology, becomes so important. Yeah. So many people talk about how important it's a fragmented mental health system and we need more integration. Yeah. But if you're just integrating stuff, you're basically exposing data and information, and it can get into the hands of the wrong people. And we're seeing a lot of that in the press at the moment with some through legal processes, insurance processes, that sometimes that information is not in the best interest of the client at all. And so being able to support really strong clinical governance frameworks to help organisations really leverage the benefits of technology and other structures in a really safe manner.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's where, like as you mentioned, the Interwell Advisory Committee and the Advisory Board, I think that's where having people like yourself to help, provide people like myself and my team that guidance, because not only do you have that clinical experience, but you've actually got that on the ground first responder, trauma experience as well, in terms of what organizations in technology need to be thinking about to create those clinical guardrails. So let's talk about then what actually helps in a crisis. And so, as you said, there's obviously a lot that goes on. You've got people on the ground, you've got a lot of people, a lot of higher ups obviously providing instruction, direction, and what have you. And so when someone has just experienced trauma, whether it's, sadly a terrorist attack or a natural disaster or even just a personal tragedy, what do they need in those first hours and days?
Yeah. So much of it is really around the calm and connection and safety. That is so, so important. Even when you look at it from a neuro perspective, even the impact, what happens in the brain, your heart pounds, your stomach twists, your intestines tighten, where your your digestive system shuts down, your short-term memory shuts down, your prefrontal cortex is completely covered in cortisol. You're thinking in more an emotional, reactive brain. You've got this kind of fight or flight. Survival, primal brain going on. And so really you need to be able to calm that to be able to get back into a whole brain state. If you're really in this real primal brain, you can't access a lot of your problem solving, your decision making. And so in order to help someone go back into that whole brain state, we need to, I guess it's like a bit of a Maslow's hierarchy of needs of really getting back into calm, connection and safety, and really meeting those absolute basic needs for survival. It's drinking clean water, actually having some nutrition, getting rest for the inflammation that even, when we see athletes that have gone through a major critical incident, then they go back up on the world stage, they're far more like their muscles are like jerky, like beef jerky. They have so much more injury. So it's really getting things absolutely back to basics. It's not about being the smartest person in the room. It's around being kind and patient with people and holding space for them. There's a couple of, I guess, debunk, things that I think one of the biggest things that, and it's all, it's so often well-intended, but there's this line that I've, in my experience, heard on the field where people say that you're having a normal experience to an abnormal event. Yeah, and that might sound lovely in theory, and I totally understand where they're coming from. But when you see that land, when someone is absolutely terrified by the physical sensations that they're experiencing in their body, they're having almost like an outer body experience and everything feels so wrong and so uncomfortable, and you tell someone that is normal, that actually terrifies them. Considering that this could be their new normal terrifies people. Wow. And so words in those moments really matter. And so often it's around using words that can have the same intention but keeping it really simple to say, I know that this was a really, really distressing event for you. I'm here to support you through this time, as opposed to it this being this big kind of headliner. Some other ones that you often find is the psychological response, like thinking you need a psychologist out there. And a lot of that is around, from a clinical perspective, the kind of what happened. I dare say it's probably one of the most dangerous things you could do is asking someone to explain.
To rehash it,
what happened. Whilst, your clinical curiosity and your kind of clinical formulation of the event is not what is needed right then, holding space for that person. And really, it's not about what happened to them. It's about how it made them feel. And so you really don't even want to get into the crux of any of that for several days. It's really about meeting the calm, connection and safety initially.
That makes sense. And as you said, it's often, my assumption is that people are coming at it with the right intentions.
Absolutely.
But as you're saying, it's like not having someone rehash, a critical moment or a critical event. When you step out of that, you think, of course that makes sense. Why would you put someone through that again if you didn't need to? So on that sort of vein, what are some of those common misconceptions about trauma support that you'd like to dispel?
Yeah. So I guess to that line that, often we will have, there's in a lot of lines of work, it's that kind of operational debrief, and that debrief is a round circle where everyone says, what did you see? What did you see? Tell me about this, tell me that. And now you've got basically the perfect boiling pot for vicarious trauma, because now everyone's exposed to things that they didn't necessarily need to be exposed to, but they're also reinforcing a narrative of seeing people who are distressed, traumatized, feeling helpless, hopeless, overwhelmed, reinforcing the lack of resources or structural support. And so that becomes what is forming their narrative. It's so incredibly important. It could be even something as simple as, someone's in a car crash and they're stuck under a car. They've been hit by a car. Sometimes it is literally crawling under that car with them and holding their hand, and then pairing a traumatic experience with feeling safe and feeling like someone cared. And that's the most important thing in a traumatic scenario, is to be able to help people pair in that moment through that rupture where their whole world feels like it's been ripped up from underneath them, that I can go through hard things and people will show up for me. Or I can go through hard things and I can use the strengths and resources within myself to get through this. That's really what you want people to walk away with. They don't need to be this incredibly insightful individual at that point in time. In time, absolutely, I think it becomes so important for people to not push things under the rug. You can have unresolved trauma or you can have resolved trauma. You'd have to give someone a frontal lobotomy for them to forget it, unfortunately. But you can help support them create a really meaningful narrative so that it doesn't paralyze them anymore when they think about it or are reminded by it. Instead, that they can focus on what are their strengths and the resources and the support. So you're ultimately starting to develop a post-traumatic growth, that they are more intelligent, more self-aware. Trauma has forced them into corners of themselves they have never met before, and they now know themselves more than they ever have before. And that's what you hope that you get from this newfound growth.
It's amazing. And as you said, it's sort of that it's almost like a reframing of that, the positives that can come out. Because usually you can't change the past and you can't change what's happened. But, hopefully you can, as you say, you can give people the tools on how they're going to respond and move forward from, obviously what they've experienced. So on that, in terms of, we talked about obviously the misconceptions, but when you're responding to collective trauma, how does that differ from individual crisis response? Given those sorts of examples that you've sort of shared.
Yeah. You're looking at a really broad picture then. So you're looking at the whole system and systems on systems on systems. So it might even be communication. How is the organisation communicating this in a timely and trauma-informed manner so that they're not traumatising more people, and they're also being respectful of confidentiality if there's particularly for the family, if there's a family involved or individuals involved. So you're supporting it end to end. So what is the communication that's going out? Is it trustworthy? Is it honest? Is it timely? Is it trauma informed? You're looking at how people were exposed. So who was directly exposed, who was indirectly exposed, who is going to be exposed in the aftermath to kind of whether it is the comms team or senior leadership, or who's going to be exposed after the fact that you need to consider. So you've really got this multi-layered consideration. And then over the course of time, once you've got the calm, the connection and the safety in place, then it's then really doubling down with them around what can we learn from this. So not about the blaming, but it's about the intelligence, that how can we become more sophisticated as individuals and as an organisation from these experiences.
That's amazing. And I think, because I know you work with a number of different organisations, as you sort of said, particularly with your history, you've had so many different jurisdictions, areas of health, and as you said, particularly like crisis management in that sort of from that perspective. But also if you think about from the clinical side of things, when you think through that and you think about the impact of whether it be trauma, and mental health can obviously surface in so many different ways, and it can be triggered by various different life events, traumatic experiences. We all know there's a myriad of reasons. I'm really curious to understand like the clinical side and the clinician side of that as well. So, you often hear about, long wait times and the complex systems for patients to navigate. That's obviously really hard for psychologists as well. And I think of the clients that I speak to who use Innerwell, and they care so deeply about the clients/patients that they're working with. And I know you're another one of those people. How do clinicians actually deal with that workload?
Yeah, I'm really passionate about this one, and you're completely right. I think we treat clinicians like they're continuously renewable, bottomless resource pits. And I think often people don't actually appreciate the level of cognitive load that it requires to provide counselling support. Even if you just think about it as almost like systems in the brain, when a psychologist is in a session, or any clinician is in a session with a client, first they're active listening. That's just one thing, like the cognitive load of just deeply listening. Then on top of that, like you're listening to what they're saying and also what they're not saying, and then trying to formulate that in with potentially 3 months worth, 6 months, no matter however long it's been, of case notes, of trying to then find patterns and their strengths and their weaknesses and their risk factors and their case formulating on the go, to then think about thoughtful questions that are insightful to help that person have an aha moment and to join some dots. Then on top of that, they are then leveraging the training, the clinical training, best practice research, to be able to then help ensure that they have got the right guardrails around, am I using an evidence-based best practice framework, so I'm not just kind of freestyling here. Is this CBT? Is this ACT? Is this DBT? Is this, it's all of these things. And then on top of like that, they then have to think about, is there any contractual requirements or purpose that they have to consider in that session? So is this an assessment? Is this a fit for work? Is this person through an EAP where there's contractual requirements around this is only short-term therapy, or is this long-term therapy, or were you referred to me for an eating disorder, or so you've got all of these, like there's already like 6 core components that they're doing in that one. And then after that 50-minute, an hour, somehow you've got to scrabble your case notes and then on to the next and on to the next and on to the next. It's literally like you're going, like it's huge. It's insane.
Yeah,
and so depending on like client caseload can be phenomenal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, and, you know, like just as you were explaining that, I'm sort of picturing like all these little spinning wheels, and it's almost like the tabs, you know, of someone's, browser. You've got all these multiple tabs going because, every clinician I speak to said they want to show up for their clients in a really empathetic and empathetic / authentic way, in the sense that they want to be there and be present in the moment versus sort of sitting there going, yep, I'm just reading my notes and just thinking about the next question I'm going to ask. But as you said, that is a huge load for any human to bear, let alone there's obviously a lot of, legal aspects, and there's so many different layers that obviously clinicians ultimately working through. If you think about the advice that you would give to a clinician because I see that where there's potentially a lot of burnout that ultimately, and people leaving the profession because it's too much. They're dealing with heavy content and it's a heavy load for them. What's your advice to clinicians? Because you've seen it through all those different sort of, aspects. What would be your advice to clinicians who are working through how to process that level of information and how they can show up for their clients in a different way? Unfortunately,
there's so many different facets, and I do a lot of clinical supervision for big EAP providers, for instance, and it really depends on what department they're working in, how much exposure they have, what caseloads. There's so many components there because do they have good clinical frameworks and structures? Are they supported by their organisation? If you've got 20 police officers on your caseload and there's a high risk there, they are holding a firearm, and if someone has been exposed to multiple critical events, the risk profile for that individual is higher than for others. So, there's so many factors involved. And so there's some 101s that you want there. You want to make sure, are you working in an organisation that genuinely cares about you and your best practice? Do they have your back to be able to support you with good clinical governance structure? Do you have a manager that you're operating with? I'd say if you're working with a high caseload with a lot of risk, don't ever do anything alone. So make sure that you're clinically documenting things well, making sure that your first things first are that you're actually doing a proper risk assessment. You can have a nice chit chat and it could go for 2.5 hours, and then you realise that person after the fact is going to say, by the way, I've been having these thoughts. Yeah. You want to really make sure that you're there to support, from that kind of hierarchy of needs first. So knowing how to do a good risk assessment, knowing how to write case notes in a way that is always going to be supportive and in the best interest of the client, because they have the right to see those case notes at any time if they like as well. Making sure that you are debriefing regularly so that you are checking in with yourself. You've got to check yourself before you're checking others, really, because otherwise that could be in your blind spot. How, if your cognitive load is too high and you don't even have that self-awareness, you could hit burnout without even realising when that slippery slope was happening. And I think really trying to leverage technology as much as you can becomes a really, it's a superpower if you know how to use it well. Yeah.
I think that was an interesting point you sort of raised. And I was thinking about that when you talk about the generation of case notes. And I don't know, and this came up obviously in our advisory committee meeting, where the time that clinicians are expected to spend, and, I've recently done a tour with clients where that feedback just came up over and over again, that the expectation on clinicians to squeeze in these clinical notes in between back-to-back appointments or after hours, where you might be trying to recap a conversation that you might have had on Monday or Tuesday and it's now Friday, or going into Saturday realizing I've got 4 hours worth of case notes and updates that I need to make to care plans. What sort of technology examples are you seeing where that's actually working for clinicians like yourself?
Yeah, so there's some big mental health organisations now that are adopting transcribing with the client's permission to be able to transcribe the session. The technology is certainly very helpful, but it's still imperfect in terms of whether someone has an accent or particular things can be summarised or implied the wrong way, or the technology might not quite know if it was the clinician talking or the client at the time. So we need a lot of human revision on these things, but it's great to see emerging technologies, and if we can nail these things, they will be phenomenal. So being able to do pre and post assessments online, where someone through just simply on their phone can be able to do it at any given moment. They could just go for a walk and sit on a park bench and now do it with their own privacy, as opposed to having to trek in, find a car park, doing a paper file. So the pre and post assessments are fantastic. Tracking your wellbeing over time is fantastic. The transcriptions, clinical insights. So even AI, being able to, the amazing thing about AI is that you can absorb huge amounts of information and find patterns in data sets really, really quickly. And so even if it's just to be able to say, almost like having a clinical admin person on, to kind of tap you on the shoulder and say, remember that thing that happened to them when they were 3 years old? Well, this kind of seems like it, to be able to have those insights starting to come forward is so helpful for a clinician.
And I think, as you're saying, the context, that additional context, because you're right, even as you're sort of thinking in a non-technology enabled or assisted sort of world, that load and that cognitive load is obviously being placed, solely on the shoulders of the clinician to have to think of all these different things and, to be able to collate that data or those data inputs from that context, I think is really valuable, because you're right, it's never designed, I think my thoughts on what I'm seeing is that it's never designed to replace a clinician. If anything, it's more like, how do we help give time back to busy clinicians to enable them to be able to show up?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much magic that even just like the gut human experience, intuition, the magic that happens through, we know that there's so much research now showing the importance of therapeutic alliance and that relationship. And, we're not born to connect with everyone, otherwise we'd marry anyone. It's that therapeutic alliance is so powerful and it is so therapeutic. And so technology just genuinely cannot replace some of the key factors, but what it can do is take away so much of that administrative burden and noise so that humans can be really focus on being human and the benefit and power of being a human.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's where I can just see the benefits in so many different ways. And it's still a lot for clinicians to sort of absorb in terms of the rate of change in what we're seeing in technology. And as you said, I think it's not perfect, but even if it takes you 70 to 80% of the way there, that's ultimately going to be a vast improvement where we were 2 years, sort of 3 years ago. So yeah, definitely to see some good improvements coming down that space. That's
Absolutely.
for sure.
And a lot of that comes down to how the organisations, that's more so around their systems of implementation. Like if it's change fatigue and they're just moving from one system to another all the time, and the clinician's not really quite sure which software they're meant to be using at one time, and there's lots of workarounds. That's more than that's a lot of the work we do at Alfi Health around being able to look at that end-to-end system process for good governance.
That workflow. I agree. I think we just want to make it nice and easy, because as I said, the more sort of the scenic route that you need to take when it comes to using different tools and different systems and having data syncing between multiple apps, that just it adds to that cognitive load for any clinician. So I agree, it's the last thing we want to see happen. So if we switch back then to, you mentioned earlier around sort of the trauma response in particular. I think one of the comments that you made was around when you're working with clinicians, and if clinicians are thinking about the experiences and what they're saying to their clients, and make sure they need to sort of check themselves as part of their service and the counselling or the experience that they're providing to their clients. One area that obviously recently sort of came to light in the media was around the coronial inquest into the Bondi Westfield stabbing. And we know that handed down its findings. And one of the things that came out of that was, that unfortunately Joel Couchy, psychiatrist, was referred to the Queensland Health Ombudsman because there were some warning signs that had come up, to say that, that obviously something they possibly could have intervened sooner. When you hear that, and you know that we just talked about the load that a busy clinician is going through, what goes through your mind? Because when I think about that clinician, what they would have experiencing, there's obviously that tension. We can see that sort of difficult tension in terms of advocating for your patient, respecting their autonomy and their privacy, and also holding that broader duty of care. So it's so layered. But from you and your clinical experience, what goes through your mind when you see those kinds of media headlines?
I mean, initially I feel empathy. It's, there's so many clinicians that would be feeling like that could have been me. And in any of these circumstances, it's not just, whilst I care deeply about good clinical care that a clinician is providing, that is, absolutely important. But there's the system. There is always, it's that kind of Swiss cheese model. There's so many broader pieces to looking at the overarching system. And so often as a clinician, you're absorbing in that moment imperfect and incomplete information in systems that, have barriers and limitations as well. So I think that's my first response is empathy. and then looking at that ultimately, that growth piece and capacity, like what can we learn from this? How can we grow? How can we be better? Because there's so much more that we can do to improve our systems to set both clinicians and just our whole community up for more success.
I agree. And I think, as you said, and everyone, no matter what you do on a day-to-day basis, every clinician that I've met so far has the best intent to provide the best level of care. No one is trying to dial it in, for lack of a better term. And I think there's so many layers and levels of complexity, and people only share what they're able to share in that moment in time. And as you said, there's a lot of expectation, I think, placed on clinicians to get it right every time. But you're not with your clients 24/7, and nor are you expected to be. So I think it's the media and the public's expectation and reality, I think, can be two different things. And as you said, balancing that risk, particularly balancing that risk is always a fine line. I think that I know a lot of clinicians I speak to always trying to, weigh those two things up from time to time. So if we think about the changes, and as you said, you talked about empathy for clinicians and the load that they're working through, what sort of types of changes would you like to see, in terms of to advocate for change, to support clinicians given the fragmentation and all the different, challenges that you're seeing in the system and what they're facing today? Yeah,
so I can use some almost like real life examples of how I would think we could go about it well. In a kind of a similar parallel, for example, one of the things we do is developing out like a peer support program. And so I'm using this as like a parallel to look at how we could approach this in terms of analysing. So just say an organisation comes forward to us and says, we have a really high demanding, high hazard environment where people are exposed to a lot of traumatic and critical incidents, and we want to help support the workplace culture to be more sustainable, and to really support them as best we can. And so they might then engage us to develop a world-class peer support program. And so we will then develop out what we generally feel really proud as a world-class standard. Then we have to bring it back to being realistic and practical. So it's the same thing when we're thinking about even just the fragmented mental health system. There's the holy grail of like, what is the best of the best? Like, what does really good look like? Because you've got to start there. If you don't know what the North Star of what great looks like, then you're just going to keep just kind of chasing your tail and going down rabbit holes. So you find the best of the best. You really identify what that is. And so I guess in mental health, it's making sure that we're not so fragmented, that we are really looking at things from almost like at a global perspective. How can we create the best counselling support? How do people engage in that in a way that feels clear, well-informed, that they know what they're going to get before they get it, and so that they can feel safe through that whole process because it's been transparent and easily communicated to them, that they have good accessibility and a good availability. Accessibility and availability are actually very different things. You can say to someone like a counsellor, there's a 1300 number on the back of the toilet door, and if you call them, that you can get counselling, and they say, we've got accessible and available counselling, but no one's going to access that if they have stigma or financial barriers or time barriers. That's not accessible. That's just available. And so I think that becomes a very big distinction of kind of looking at all of the different barriers that are going to limit us from being world class, and then working realistically between what those barriers are and how do we close those gaps. And so I think that's where we really need to start, is looking at what is the world class of what good looks like. Do we even have, like if we had a collective project of people, could we all agree on what that actually is, what great is? And then what are the barriers that are impacting people from getting those things and being able to close those gaps? And so when I use that peer support example, it was developing a world-class program and then going to that organisation and practically saying, what is your limitations to being that? Is it lack of resourcing? Is it lack of leaders that are trained? Is it lack of funding to be able to just train people to know that this model's in place? Like, what are the things? And now how can we either compromise to get to a standard that is still very, very high standard, or what can we do to raise the bar to get you even closer to where we need to go? And Amazing. Once you achieve those things, you have an end-to-end, very sophisticated product. And unfortunately, a lot of the times what we have is something that's clunky and not sophisticated.
Yeah. And I think it's as you said, it's a lot of what I see. There's a lot of, as you said, resource limitations, funding limitations, and it's, everyone aspires to have that gold standard and that sort of world-class benchmark. But it's almost like for some people and some organisations, it just feels unobtainable because because of all those sort of barriers that seem to sort of get in the way. But I think, as you said, we've got to have a goal.
And so often people are well intended to have, we've just got X million dollars to help support mental health, but so often we haven't actually taken the time at the start to really make sure that the goal is what is actually the best goal.
Agreed.
So sometimes we are, we're getting better each time, but there's a lot of waste that can occur during that process.
And I think it's sad because I think for me, what I see, it comes from a really good place. And I think whether it's, media announcements, XYZ amount of funding has been allocated to ABC organisation to support, this particular crisis that's emerged. And I think they're amazing in the intent that's behind them. But then, as you were saying, it's the practical timing of when that announcement has been made to when people are actually being able to be enabled and set up for success to be able to provide that support, whether it's more clinicians, more support, more services, more tools, whatever the case may be. That time lag can be in some cases I can say it can be 6 to 9 months. And to me, from a layman's perspective, it almost looks like, but isn't that too late?
Yeah. And that's why I feel like for a lot of organisations until now where there's been this kind of work health and safety law crunch, compliance felt like just this huge red tape. Because unless you've got subject matter experts in there with efficiency who also understand from an organisational perspective that business has got to run, it's got a bottom line. And, if you're kind of just sitting around twiddling your thumbs, like trying to be all warm and fuzzy, you might go bankrupt. You've got to find this balance. And so you really do have to have this genuine understanding of what the business needs to be achieving as well as what the people need to help them achieve that.
Yeah, and how that integrates in. Yeah, that makes total sense. So if you think about, we've sort of talked a little bit around, the gaps and some of the accessibility gaps. And in our first episode with Dr. Frankie Fino, we talked a lot about the accessibility problem in healthcare, long wait times, bouncing around for different providers. And, and in your experience, is that something that you've seen? Have you seen those similar issues given the different sort of aspects and areas of mental health where you've practiced?
Yes, absolutely. That was one of the core things that we tried to achieve at Listen, and really, really proud of what we did there. But ultimately what we were seeing is that technology can be phenomenal in helping people find their best fit, often by people sharing just a couple of little things that they want support with, as opposed to what are the things that you're struggling with, and then being able to then connect you with clinicians that have expertise in those areas, being able to have leveraging technology through telehealth so that geographically you don't have that barrier anymore. That can support wait times as well, because particularly, for instance, if you're in a regional location and there's one psychologist and they're fully booked, it can be really, really hard. You don't have any other alternatives. The other thing, I guess, that happens through that process is that sometimes you might just get referred to whoever they know on their book, but that they may not be a psychologist that actually has the specialty that you need. And so then you bounce around the system. You've lost time and money and probably deteriorated through that process as well. So, yeah, absolutely. You see a huge amount of that.
And so when you think about those aha moments that you've had where you've actually thought the system's broken or we're doing this wrong, can you think of any examples when you've had that light bulb moment going, yep, this is where it's not working?
Lots.
Probably too many to mention for our podcast.
Yes. I mean, and that's what I love, and I feel so privileged to be in a place where you can really then, it's just around getting into being really practical. Like, yes, you need this kind of blue sky view, but really starting to bring it back to the basics of what do really people need to be able to operate effectively. And so even when it's coming back to the simple things of calm and connection and safety, how can we create that as an absolute 101 within an organisation? So working with leaders around them understanding how to address particular situations with more emotional intelligence, with more self-awareness. Because what you often find with organisations is that they can actually help be part of the problem, or they can really support being part of the solution. And there's a lot of research now backing that when someone has been exposed to some really a really challenging circumstance, it's often if they are in a healthy psychological environment, their propensity to recover is so much faster. So it really comes down to the bigger system at play. So being able to go into workplaces, really support the clinical governance frameworks around them for how does that business operate, so that when those circumstances happen, it's not like a deer in the headlights going, what the hell do we do now? And that's where you can actually find then you get this domino effect of more harm done, that by going in a preventative approach, really practically and saying there's some really basic things that you can do as an organisation to have good clinical governance, to have good clinical frameworks in place so that managers feel empowered. They feel like they've got the tools and the skills to be able to address the issues that happens within their staff members. And so you find you get these really, really effective workplaces very, very simply. And then another one from our home, and it's just so obvious that we need to use technology and how technology really can benefit the cognitive load on a clinician, and how it can support both a practice and a clinician. As an example there, that when we use technology and clinicians in unison, one of the core things that we can do with technology is use it as a guardrail. And so when that guardrail, when we create clinical technology that creates prompts and support for the clinician, one thing it does is that it teaches the clinician what best practice looks like. And so then they actually develop proper clinical governance habits by doing those things, and structure and repetition. But it's also then reducing the cognitive load that, you haven't closed off that risk assessment, or you haven't closed off that safety plan, or it's been 3 months since you set that goal, or this was the next goal that they wanted to focus on, or you haven't set goals for your counselling yet, you've just been chit-chatting. Whatever it is, you're actually, through that, it's amazing what we can do there to be able to reduce burnout, but actually increase the sophistication of the clinical care that we have.
Absolutely. We've painted a pretty challenging picture, of mental health, and obviously all the different areas that you've been exploring, throughout your career, where you think about, crisis, response gaps, wait times, stigma, cost. You've mentioned around technology and how you've seen how it can help. What would be like the one thing? Because there's so much in technology, and I think if people are listening to this podcast, I think Tahnee has a wealth of knowledge going in that busy brain, in terms of all the different cognitive load that we mentioned. If you were to pick one thing in terms of technology and where you've seen it has had its greatest impact, what would you say that would be?
I think it's just the speed and efficiency. To be able to absorb huge amounts of data and information, and to be able to see patterns and create insights from that. That is so powerful, because that's one of the most fundamental things as a human being that we have had on us as cognitive load, because nobody else, we can't, there's not a pet or a thing that can do that. You're on your own there. And so to be able to have technology, to be able to really almost be like your partner in crime there, to be able to support you and say, these are patterns that we're now seeing. These are insights that we're now suggesting. You don't want to take it on face value, but you want to be able to use it purely as a tool. At this point, we're not sophisticated enough, and maybe we'll never be. But the efficiency and of the capability of insight, and to be able to bring things really to a sophisticated world-class level, because we're gathering huge amounts of information and creating really, really poignant insights.
Yeah. And I think, obviously AI plays a huge role in that. And I think it wouldn't be from a technology point of view, not talking about AI from that perspective, but how do you see, as an overall risk or an overall benefit in the mental health landscape, given that example?
And there's absolutely risks and benefits. It's a phenomenal thing to be able to use technology, and I dare say I think every single psychologist should be using it, every single practice should be using it. The accessibility, the affordability, the guardrails, the clinical best practice that comes from it, even just the safety of notes, the physical notes being removed, so they can't accidentally be stolen or burnt down in a warehouse fire, or that even from that there's far more compliance and safety and structure there. And whilst all of those things help so much in the best interest of client, for there to be more efficiency, for them to have visibility as a client to see when is the next appointment available, I can now, even when we think about trauma-informed best practice around choice and trust and transparency, they can now see clinician profiles. They can now book their next session. They can now have access to their own goals and their own assessment information. They are part of working in a collaborative process, as opposed to being, all of that before they were running blind. They didn't have access to that information. So it's phenomenal in that perspective. From a risk perspective, the thing that is so important to me and I guess keeps me up at night is it is around making sure that data and information is secure and does not get into the hands of the wrong people.
Yeah, I agree. And that's particularly the heaviness of what people are often sharing. I think that is definitely the risk that you hear from a lot of clinicians, particularly when you think about, any kind of live recording, transcription. It's like if someone's talking about deep trauma that's occurred to them, you would be horrified to think that would fall into the wrong hands. And I think good tech companies obviously have to take that seriously. Where's the data hosted? What happens with the data? How can we de-anonymized? And so if we think now about, if someone's listening right now and, or they know someone who's struggling with trauma, what are the actual steps that you think they should take?
I think first and foremost, just be really kind and patient with yourself. So often it's the blame or those limited beliefs, that you're not good enough or that really start to limit us. But just be kind and patient with yourself first and foremost, and just take it 1 minute at a time. All you have to do is just get through this minute or even this hour, whatever. Just break it into bite-sized pieces first and foremost. I would say then reach out to someone. Don't bottle it up. Don't keep it to yourself. And you don't need to have all the answers. It can be messy and not even make sense. But we learn how we feel when we hear ourselves say it. When it's up in your head, it can go into all little directions and you never quite even unpack or make sense. But to say something out loud really helps the brain create this linear understanding of your sense of self and really broadens your self-awareness. And so I would really, really hope that anyone who's struggling right now would reach out to someone that they trust. It might even be talking to your dog initially, talking to your cat. It's talking to a friend, talking to a peer support officer, just sharing that with someone, calling Lifeline, calling Beyond Blue, but just starting the conversation, and even saying, I don't even know how I feel. I don't even know where to begin. It's okay. You can start anywhere, and the pieces will start to make a little bit more sense each time.
It's amazing advice. And I think you're right. It's sometimes we overlook the simple things in life in terms of fresh air, water, nutrition, and just taking a minute, just to breathe, just to breathe through it. And I think, as you said, asking for help there's absolutely no shame in asking for help or speaking to people about what's going through your mind. So I love that. So to finish up, sort of looking ahead, we've covered a lot of topics today and we've covered a lot, which has been really insightful. And that's why I said I was so looking forward to seeing, because you've got such an amazing experience and there's so many layers to your experiences in mental health. So looking ahead, if we were to wave a magic wand and redesign mental health crisis response and accessibility from the ground up, no constraints, what would that look like, Tahnee? What would it look like?
God.
Talk to me. What would it look like? Magic wand.
How long have we got?
Yeah, go for it.
I really hope we become more sophisticated. Because there is so much wisdom and knowledge. It's all there. I think there is so much we already know, but I really would hope that we would really bring this back to basics and just all stop for a minute and develop a system where we really understand the fundamental basics. There's a 101. Anyone in this world going through a critical or traumatic experience, that just the first and foremost thing is how can we create an environment where we support our community to have calm and safety and connection. 101. Before all of the big bells and whistles and the media and all of those things, how do we can support that? So in a workplace, how do we bring that back into a protocol that feels calm and sophisticated and practical? And how do we do that on a global scale for all individuals? It then comes down into coordination from a systems perspective. So how do we coordinate so that the right people are in the room at the right time? So often we are well intended to get people in and to show our response, but it really comes back to creating a really calm, succinct process where, from an organisational perspective, it's leaders. From a global perspective, it comes to leaders. In all aspects, in the family home, it comes down to leaders. Yeah. We've got to make sure that we're training those leaders to be able to understand what are those core things that people need in a traumatic incident. It's a teacher in a schoolyard with a 4-year-old, that, it's the calm, the connection, and the safety is the 101 piece. If people have got that and they can go home and they can rest and eat, and have some nutrition, and already their recovery will be so much better. From there, I think it comes down to some of those other things I was saying is how do we normalize someone's experience without saying this is normal, because that can really scare someone. How do we make sure that we hold space for people that if they want to talk about the event, absolutely they can operationally debrief about it, and you hold space and you let them lead the way. But you never ask someone to explain to them what happened. You're focusing on how it made them feel and how you can support them through their experiences of making sense of why was I scared, what supports were there, what do I need next. And I want us to really change us from this being this victim broken language. And I know so often we do this out of absolute respect, but it has to be more of survivor-led, action-based language that we need to start using to show more respect for individuals who have genuinely survived phenomenal things, and not focusing on the resilience of continuously enduring and showing up, but instead not tolerating those things and learning from each experience that we have. I think that's where technology will be able to help us, because those huge data points across all the world of all of these things are happening, we can pull those together and have insights pretty quickly around what we can do to start addressing some of the systematic issues that we have at a micro and a macro level.
Yeah. Tahnee, amazing insights today shared on the podcast. I can't thank you enough just for being here and also just sharing the impact that you've had, and I know that you'll continue to have in the field of mental health. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciated having you on the podcast. Thank you so much.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.